Good morning and welcome. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Diane Walker, and I'll be speaking with you about contemplative photography as an act of faith. Back in the days when I was living in Vermont and heating my house with wood, we used to say wood warms you four ways. Once when you cut it down, once when you drag it home, once when you chop it into kindling, and once when you burn it. For me, contemplative photography works the same way. You get several opportunities to be warmed by that spark of the sacred. That divine spark expresses itself as a kind of recognition, and it happens for me at four different points in the process. When the subject calls to me, when I'm deciding how to photograph it, when I open the resulting image on my computer, and finally, when I decide to engage with the image and see what it has to teach me. And in each case, it all seems to be about paying attention, being present, being mindful. First, of course, you need to get a camera. I've always been a writer and not much of an artist, so when I began working for the Episcopal bishop in 1992 and realized I would need to learn to take photographs for my job as a newspaper editor, I didn't have a lot of ego involved in the process. I found a handy little point-and-shoot camera and pretty much just let it do its thing, which meant I was open and receptive, not as controlling as I might be in other areas of my life. The shots I took weren't great, but they worked fine for the paper. But in 1996, I quit that job and moved to the San Juan Islands. And shortly after I moved there, my mother died. And at that point, the camera, precisely because it didn't involve a lot of control and wasn't connected to writing or thinking, became a lifeline, an instrument for healing. It helped me process my grief. I mostly just shot what I felt like shooting: driftwood, the beach, my children, the ordinary miracles of life, nothing too earth-shattering. But the beauty of those everyday aspects of my life provided a sort of balm for my soul. By 1998, I was actually selling some of my photos, and I decided to purchase a single-lens reflex camera. I bought a couple of nice lenses and began learning to control things like aperture and exposure. But essentially, I was still letting the camera do the work. I took a class and was taught that an amateur photographer takes a picture and a professional makes a picture. But, and this might be simply a function of age, after all, I didn't start taking pictures until I was in my late 40s. I was still pretty much happy just taking pictures. I'd do the work of making myself available, which is more a matter of showing up and keeping your camera handy. And I'd do my best to be consciously present in case something photographable might emerge. But it felt like cheating to arrange the elements of a photo beyond the simple choices of going out at dawn or dusk or on a foggy morning. And so I didn't become an equipment jock, and I didn't start trying to control the process, which turned out to be a good thing. This all sounds really intentional, of course, but it wasn't in the beginning. In those days, I was just shooting everything that called to me, everything that was even remotely photographable: people, boats, animals, buildings. And of course, not everything I shot was great, so there were only a few things that I would print and frame. And those things, when I put them together in a portfolio, didn't seem to have all that much in common with each other. There wasn't a lot of consistency. But I said something about that to the curator at a gallery I'd been showing in for a while, and he said, "Oh no, I can always spot a Diane Walker photograph." Apparently what he saw was a kind of meditative serenity to all of my work. And that's when I realized that my photography was being influenced by my spirituality, that what set me apart was that I was essentially a contemplative photographer. Photography, for me, even before I was really conscious of it, had become an act of faith. But what does that mean, to be a contemplative? What does it mean for photography to be an act of faith? I've been reading Ed Bastian's new book on interspiritual meditation, And the other day I found in that book a wonderful definition of the word contemplation. Contemplation, he says, is not an aimless meandering of thought, but a disciplined activity by which one explores and investigates an idea, an insight, a sacred persona, or a truth in a thoroughgoing way, pursuing its consequences for all aspects of our lives. And once I looked at it that way, I could begin to see parallels between his definition of contemplation and the way the spirit was moving through my photography. So, what do I mean by that? To be a contemplative photographer is essentially an act of faith, and it has these same four contemplative components. The discipline lies in being aware and open. It's a commitment to listen for that divine spark, even to seek it out, and to keep my camera with me so that I can respond. The activity is the response to the spark, the conscious act of composing the photo in order that the subject may speak most effectively through the camera. The idea, truth, or insight then appears, somehow, in the finished photo, and the consequences become clear when I engage with that photograph and try to understand and write about what it could possibly have to teach me. The photo serves as a metaphor for some aspect of the spiritual life, and the whole process is about faith and trust, a trust that somehow, in engaging with that metaphor, I can learn something about that truth or insight and the consequences it has or will have on my life and the lives of those around me. Once I understood better what I was about, I began cutting back on the number of photos I took, watching for a certain interior response, and choosing to concentrate on shooting when that sense of rightness was present. Essentially, I was listening to my eyes, trying to hear what needed to be photographed and what could be ignored. I began to be more conscious of my surroundings, more present, more attentive to the moment and to the possibilities it might hold. In this case, for example, I was visiting my daughter at Harvard Summer School. She was a long way from home, and though she came home with straight A's, it was a very intense summer for her. It didn't get off to a good start and went downhill from there, through little fault of her own, with lots of the sort of adventures no parent wishes on a child. And so, when we flew out for a brief rescue mission and I saw her walking up the stairs of this ancient dormitory where she lived, I just had to get out my camera. It was a very emotional moment, a very evocative setting, and I wanted to capture it on film. It was all about beginnings and determination, and it has served as an initial image both for my own book on the Gospel of Thomas and also for another book for which I just completed the illustrations, a book on spiritual practice to be published by Credo, a national wellness organization for Episcopal clergy. So sometimes the moment, like the one I just described, is accidental. The feeling comes first and you just have to hope you have your camera with you, and that's one kind of discipline. But you also need to be conscious about showing up and about when and where you show up. So, for example, in the case of this photo, I woke up and noticed it was a foggy morning, so I dragged myself out of bed and went down to the docks because I know from experience that boats and fog are a good fit for me. So that was the discipline of it. I dragged myself out into the cold and damp because I had faith that there might be something there that needed to voice itself through my camera. But even if something's calling to me, I need to figure out how best to photograph it, to evaluate the mood and position the camera, to listen for the moment when I should snap the shutter. I have to notice what's happening, and then I need to wait for the right moment. In the case of this photo, that moment came when both those oars in that little boat in the back of the picture were out of the water. I need to say that I've been using Photoshop at work for over 20 years now. But for most of my career as a photographer, I've actually been opposed to photo manipulation. It just didn't fit in with what I thought photography should be. I didn't even get a digital camera until 2004. But a little over a year ago, my daughter and my husband decided to buy me a new computer and the latest version of Photoshop. And I have to say it led to a major turning point in my career as a contemplative photographer, because I quickly discovered that Photoshop too offers an opportunity for divine inspiration. It started when I just began playing with images like these chair legs, reflected in the floor of the lodge at Camp Houston, the Episcopal Camp and Conference Center up in Gold Bar, Washington. By intensifying the colors and then reflecting and warping the image, I arrived at something very different and, I think, surprisingly spiritual. But I was just following my instincts. So I started making a practice of it, shooting things that might not stand alone as photos, but could have potential to become something else. I'd bring them up on my computer screen and experiment with them. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But I began to trust that if I engaged with the image and followed my instincts, some new truth or observation might emerge. I just had to pay attention and follow my heart. So I began experimenting with my new Photoshop, and over a period of about 4 months, these weird images I call goddesses began emerging. I thought I was just playing. They were sort of fun to watch. But then an artist friend of mine asked if I would put them all together on a page of my online photo albums. And when I did that, she called to tell me she'd burst into tears when she saw them. It turns out that, unbeknownst to me, she'd had a mastectomy years ago and had not elected to have reconstructive surgery. My goddess images had helped her realize she'd never mourned her loss of symmetry. So then I thought, well, I'll make them into a book and dedicate any income from that to some aspect of breast cancer research. It was easy enough to do, I thought. Just put each one on a page with the name of the characteristic she represents. For example, these are innocence, serenity, connectedness, and grace. But when I compiled them into the book, it turned out they had a story to tell, which I'll share with you here. It's brief, and I'm not going to give you all the images to go with it, but it sounds like this. In the beginning, life abounds with innocence and simplicity. We live in a world of fantasy and beauty. We are blessed with courage and with boundless creativity. We approach life with playfulness and cultivate our own personal style. We develop a sense of confidence and begin to unearth our sensuality. But inevitably, difficulties arise, and we find we must surrender. And then we are faced with the reality of loss. Forced to deal with complexity, we learn practicality. In learning to practice patience, we develop perseverance. Despite the shattering of our vision, we discover our natural resilience. And in the face of our brokenness, we discover our capacity for endurance, flexibility, and fortitude. In our newfound vulnerability, we find hidden reserves of faith. We begin to understand the value of clarity and the healing power of openness. We learn to appreciate our connectedness and cultivate a sense of compassion. Eventually, we uncover new depths of passion and tap into our inner joy. And so, ultimately, from our sorrow, we learn wisdom, and from our struggles, grace, at last arriving at a place of serenity. And from the ashes, love emerges. So now I want to talk about the ways in which my writing, which is something I've always done, began to interact with my photography. When I first started doing centering prayer, I usually began with some Lectio Divina, a reading from the Bible. And sometime around 2002, I began playing with the idea of pairing photographs with passages from the daily lectionary. Pretty soon I was writing brief reflections on the daily lectionary and pairing those with photos. This photo, which was taken of the bean at Chicago's Millennium Park, felt like the chambers of a heart to me, and so I wrote a poem about compassion. Dwelling in the heart of God, I see my own being reflected in each person whose life touches mine. What touches you touches me. When I forget who and where I am, step outside these hollow caverns spilled out like blood, I become the enemy. In the battle to return to center, What is it that is won or lost? Take my hand. Let us share the spoils of victory. Over time, those meditations resulted in a traveling art exhibit called the Contemplative Photographer's Alphabet, which has been displayed in several cathedrals and churches around the country. And then I ended up turning that exhibit into a book because so many people who saw the exhibit wanted to take the images and poems home with them to ponder. And then in 2005, Cynthia Bourgeot introduced me to In Trouble and in Wonder, Lynn Bauman's study guide to the Gospel of Thomas. I'd never encountered the Gospel of Thomas before, and by this time in my life I was feeling a bit estranged from Christianity. But Thomas pulled me right back in. It was so inspiring to see the words of Jesus without any of those troubling myths attached, and to see Jesus' words in the context of wisdom sayings from other religions, as Lynn Bauman had put them, sparked again this sense that I had that all faiths are really one. So I threw myself into the study guide and started writing daily poems in response. When I typed up the poems, they seemed again to cry out to be paired with my photographs. This poem and image, which are an example, are paired with Logian, however you say that, 57, from the Gospel of Thomas, which reads as follows. Yeshua says, God's realm is like this. A farmer planted good seed in his field, but at night enemies came and sowed it with weeds. When he found out, he did not allow them to be pulled up, saying, No, you might uproot the grain along with the weeds. Wait till harvest. It will be perfectly apparent then which ones are the weeds, and you may pull them out easily and burn them. So the reflection I wrote, which is entitled Judgment, reads like this. Who are you to decide which is the weed and which the flower? Just grow, be. Rejoice in your companions. Cease your endless judging. Let the burning come later, when the season for growth has come to an end. And then in October of 2007, a friend of mine who was blogging out her grief over the loss of her 12-year-old daughter showed me how to use the Blogspot to set up a blog. And it was like a whole new world opened up for me. Not only could I begin putting my Thomas meditations out on the internet, but I could also begin sharing some of what my photographs were beginning to teach me. And that's how my current practice evolved. Now I awaken every morning, read a chapter or so of something spiritual with my cup of coffee, do my centering prayer, sit down at my computer, wander through my photos and see what's calling to me, post it on my blog, and then write about what I'm feeling, what I'm learning from my writing, and what the picture has to tell me about all that. And there's that contemplative process again, the discipline of sitting down and meditating, the activity of finding a photo, the time spent examining it to search for the idea or the truth, and then the writing itself, exploring and sharing the consequences of that truth. So here's a brief sample from my meditation blog, which is called contemplativephotography.com. This particular post was called All Parts of the Picture, and it was written during Thanksgiving of this past year. We spent much of yesterday at the Academy of Sciences in Golden Gate Park, admiring their rainforest and aquarium. Water, bright colors, plants, reflections. This photographer was very happy. But of course, that time was almost literally life in a bubble. Back home, there are still power outages and homeless people sleeping on cold streets in the snow. And elsewhere in the world, conflict is brewing that could significantly affect us all. I find it difficult at times to carry all this in awareness, to listen to discussions about Rolex watches at the dinner table after walking by the homeless boy with his sad little dog all bundled up in blankets, to be focusing on all this beauty when there's so much ugliness in the world. But perhaps that's the job, to find a way to hold the space for everything, the good and the bad, the rich and the poor, the beautiful and the ugly, the pure and the messy, the bright and the dark, the colorful and the quiet, and to find a way to see them all not as opposites, but as equally valid and tender parts of the larger picture. Working with the blog was so much fun that I started another blog just to do poetry. So now, each day after I write the meditation on contemplativephotography.com, I return to my photo files and search for a photograph that might be called to mind by the meditation I've just written. And then I post that photo on my poetry blog, contemplativepoetry.com, and write a poem about it. I have one rule, and that is that the poem cannot be any longer on the page than the picture, so they're all quite brief. This one, for example, is entitled Essential Wounds. It's an old idea that wounds can heal much faster when protective dressings are removed, when the self-constructed band-aids that mask these gaping holes are peeled away, ripping as they go, to expose what, at first glance, may seem ugly or diseased, but upon a closer look might prove to be the womb in which true self lies huddled, waiting to be born. So that's it. That's how contemplative photography as an act of faith has become, for me at least, a journey to the sacred. The 4 ways in which the spirit moves through the process: finding a subject, taking the picture, evaluating the image, and then writing about it, nicely parallel the 4 steps of contemplation. There's a discipline to it, then an active exploration, usually some truth or insight to be gained, and in the end, some consequences to be learned and shared along the way. But in closing, I want to say this. Though I love the blog, the most amazing thing to come out of all of this has been my interactions with the Gospel of Thomas, which really restored my relationship with Jesus. Those reflections have been published as a book now, but because it's self-published on Blurb and because there's so many illustrations, it's pretty expensive. So I just want to remind you that everything in the book can be found online in my Thomas blog, thomasgospel.blogspot.com. I hope you'll check it out. And in conclusion, if I were to share any last words about contemplative photography, I think they would be this. All creativity, not just photography, is really an act of faith. So I invite you to explore your own creativity, whatever form that might take. Take on a practice, a discipline. Have fun with it. Release your need for control, and don't be afraid to experiment. Stay open to possibility, and trust in the process, because here's what I believe. There's wisdom everywhere, all around you. You just have to pay attention.